If you have founded a GmbH, you should of course know what tax obligations this GmbH has. And that's exactly the question we will answer in this video. A very important note at the beginning. I know most of you will already be aware of this. But from the comments on other videos, I can always clearly see that some of you are still quite confused about this particular matter. A GmbH is a completely independent legal entity. This means that a GmbH has absolutely nothing to do with you personally. As an individual, you can have two distinct roles within this GmbH. First, you can be the managing director. That's kind of like being a parent, actually. This means you speak on behalf of the GmbH, or you can be the owner. Of course, you can also be both. But the GmbH itself is completely separate from you personally. This is different from a sole proprietorship, where you as a person are both the business and the private individual. With a GmbH, you've separated the business completely. So when I talk about the tax liability of the GmbH, that doesn't mean at all that your own tax liability is somehow settled by that. But first, let's take a look at the tax liability of the GmbH. The first type of tax is value-added tax, commonly known as VAT. This is a tax that is basically applied to all of your sales. That means when your GmbH issues an invoice, for example, for 1,000 euros, you must add VAT on top of those 1,000 euros. The standard VAT rate is 19% of your sales. For 1,000 euros, you add another 19%, which is 190 euros, making the total invoice 1,190 euros. Some sales are subject to 7% or even 0% due to special regulations. But all of this is independent of the legal form. That means all the regulations regarding the VAT law apply to you as a GmbH, as a GbR, as a sole proprietor, basically to everyone. That's why the whole topic of VAT isn't a big issue for GmbHs, because you basically have to pay attention to it everywhere as soon as you're self-employed. And with your invoices, you always collect these 19, 7 or 0% VAT, and then you have a total amount of VAT that you have received from your customers. And from this total VAT amount, you can then deduct VAT amount specifically, the amounts you yourself have paid to your suppliers, service providers, and so on. You also have business expenses, and these business expenses also include VAT. For example, you buy a new computer for 800 euros net. 19% VAT is added to that. That means 152 euros. This means that, in fact, at MediaMarkt, Saturn, Amazon, or wherever, you don't pay 800 euros, but rather 952 euros. And the included VAT can then be offset as part of your VAT pre-declaration. That means you calculate the total amount of VAT you have received minus the total amount of VAT you have paid to suppliers and service providers. And what remains is the so-called tax liability. And that is the amount you actually have to pay to the tax office and also report to the tax office. You do all of this as part of the VAT pre-declaration. This has to be done monthly or quarterly. I've already recorded a separate video about this. I'll link it you the top right corner if you're interested learning the frequency. And once a year, you have to submit an annual VAT return. So far, so good, and honestly, unspectacular. Just for completeness, let me mention, as a GmbH, you can also make use of the small business regulation. The small business regulation is a simplification rule. If chosen, you won't deal with VAT. So you don't show any VAT, you can't claim input tax, you don't file advanced VAT returns, you don't submit an annual VAT return, and so on. You simply have nothing at all to do with the topic of VAT. But it's really, really important. You can only do all this up to certain turnover limits. And if you're below the thresholds for the small business regulation, honestly, the whole GmbH legal form doesn't really make much sense. You'll have so much effort and so many costs that in most cases, it's simply not worth it to set up a GmbH. That means if you're still making so little revenue, you should rather run your self-employment as a sole proprietorship instead of founding a GmbH. And with that, we come to the second type of tax. And the second type of tax you're also familiar with if you're a business owner, that is, if you're a sole proprietor, namely trade tax. You pay trade tax based on your profit. That means you do your bookkeeping. Once a year, you prepare an annual financial statement, and at the end, there's a profit. And you pay trade tax on this profit. However, the trade tax isn't quite that simple, primarily because it isn't exactly the same everywhere. Trade tax is levied by the municipality or city where your GmbH is based. And each individual municipality can set its very own specific trade tax rate, which can vary quite a lot. This means that in actual fact, you typically pay less trade tax in some municipalities in Germany than in others. Generally speaking, the trade tax tends to be a bit higher in large metropolitan areas and somewhat lower in structurally weaker regions. That's why I can't actually tell you here exactly how much trade tax you will have to pay for your GmbH. The tax burden ranges from about 13 or 14% up to 17 or 18%. So as a rule of thumb, you can say you'd pay around 15%, slightly more in Munich, for example, and a bit less in Leverkusen. At this point, here are two more notes. First, there is no tax-free allowance. This means you pay trade tax from the very first euro of profit, but the tax rate does not increase after that. In other words, it stays the same, whether you make 1 euro or 100 million euros in profit. You do have this tax-free allowance, for example, if you are a sole proprietor operating as a sole trader. GmbHs do not have this tax-free allowance. Additionally, there is no way to offset the trade tax you have paid. You might know this from having a GbR or a sole proprietorship, where you can offset the trade tax you paid against your personal income tax return, so the trade tax is not an actual financial burden. This is not the case with a GmbH. It's relatively easy to explain why. Because a GmbH does not pay income tax, this means that the trade tax paid by a GmbH is actually a real tax. That means you really have to pay it, and you can't offset it in any way. You have no allowances or anything like that. If you're interested in the topic of trade tax, I'll link a video about it for you in the top right corner. Feel free to check it out. And with that, we come to the third type of tax, namely corporate tax. Corporate tax is basically like income tax for corporations. So that includes GmbHs as well. However, compared to income tax, corporate tax is much simpler to calculate. With income tax, as we know, there's a progressive tax rate. The first approximately 12,000 euros are tax-free, which is the basic allowance. Then the tax starts off very gradually until at some point it amounts to 45% of your income. None of that applies to corporate tax. Corporate tax is 15% of your profit. It doesn't matter at all whether you make 1 euro in profit, 1,000 euros or 1 billion euros. You pay 15% corporate tax on every euro of profit. And that's all there is to the calculation. Of course, this means that the higher your profit, the more attractive the GmbH becomes from a tax perspective. With just 1 euro in profit, the corporate tax is higher than the income tax. With a profit of 1 million or 1 billion euros, the corporate tax is of course noticeably lower than the income tax. And this is how the GmbH gains a tax advantage compared to a sole proprietorship. But honestly, that's really all there is to say about corporate tax. That means the calculation is truly simple. Let's summarize everything once more. If you have a GmbH, you issue invoices and receive invoices. And all of these, let's say everyday transactions, are subject to value-added tax. That means you definitely have to take care of all the VAT-related processing. And then once a year, you determine the profit of your GmbH and pay first 15% corporate tax. And then, depending on the municipality or city where you are based, an additional 13 to 18% trade tax. All in all, this means that your total tax burden on your profit fluctuates between 28 and 32%. That's why people often say, as a rule of thumb, that GmbHs pay 30% tax on their profits. And honestly, that's usually pretty accurate. An important note at this point, which I already mentioned at the beginning of the video, these 30% in taxes are paid by the GmbH. But that doesn't mean you personally can now spend the remaining 70%. Because that money belongs to the GmbH. Let's look at a simple example. Your GmbH makes a profit of 100,000 euros. First, it pays 15% of those 100,000 euros in corporate tax, leaving 85%. Then, it also pays trade tax on those 100,000 euros. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that this happens to be exactly 15% as well. So, from those 85,000 euros, you end up with 70,000 euros in after-tax profit. That means these 70,000 euros are now taxed. But they belong to the GmbH. So you personally don't have any of it yet. However, if you are the owner, that is a shareholder of the GmbH, you could now decide to distribute those 70,000 euros to your personal assets. But this distribution is also subject to tax again. That means you distribute 70,000 euros to yourself and then have to pay another 25% capital gains tax on it. So from the remaining 70,000 euros, another 25% is deducted, which amounts to 17,500 euros. In the end, after full taxation in your personal assets, only 52,500 euros remain. This means that the total tax burden at the GmbH level and at the personal level through the distribution amounts to 47.5%. And this is a very common misconception because I keep hearing that GmbHs are supposedly so much more attractive from a tax perspective. Yes, but in order to actually spend the money privately, you have to distribute it again. And that often leads to GmbHs not being as attractive as people make them out to be. By the way, you also have a second option for getting the money out of this GmbH. You might not only be the owner, that is the shareholder of this GmbH, but you can also simply employ yourself there. That's not possible if you have a sole proprietorship, because you can't employ yourself. But you can employ yourself in your GmbH, and then you get the following effect. You can have a monthly payslip created for your work in this GmbH, and you then pay yourself this salary. And as part of this payslip, you pay regular income tax. That means the first 12,000 euros are initially tax-free, and then it depends on your tax class and so on. So you have a few payroll tax deductions there. And the advantage is that these salary payments, including ancillary wage costs, are business expenses for the GmbH. This means you are not distributing after-tax profit as salaries here, but generating expenses for the GmbH. This can reduce the GmbH's profit to zero depending on your salary. This leads to the result that you don't pay anything at the GmbH level. Instead, you only pay your income tax personally as part of the payroll process. Covering this entire topic in detail would probably go beyond the scope of this video. But if you're interested in how to get money out of a GmbH in the most optimal way so that you can spend it privately, let me know in the comments and I'll make a separate video about it. And otherwise, if you have questions about the taxation of GmbHs or UGs, which are ultimately also GmbHs, feel free to ask your question in the comments and I'll be happy to help you out. And if you're looking for reliable accounting software, secure bank accounts or expert tax advisors for your GmbH, then take a comprehensive look at the video description below. I've linked all my recommendations there, including my own firm, or you can simply click here. And if you're in the mood, you could also watch 1 or 2 more videos on this channel. There are a few hundred that I've prepared for you, for example this one or this one.